In this video, we're going to talk about electrolytic cells. So in our last video, we talked about galvanic cells. So let's just recall what those were. So in a galvanic cell, redox reactions are occurring and they're used to produce electrical energy. And they can do this because the reactions are spontaneous. So they're reactions that will proceed on their own without any outside assistance. You just put the two reactants together and the reaction's going to occur. For reactions that are non-spontaneous, so they'll only proceed with some sort of outside assistance, you can use electricity to make them occur. So you apply the electrical energy, and then that gives the reaction the energy it needs to actually move forward. So that process is called electrolysis. And so that's what electrolytic cells do. So an electrolytic cell is a device that converts electrical energy into chemical energy by forcing a redox reaction to occur. So an electrolytic cell consists of two electrodes, an anode and a cathode, an electrolyte solution, and an external power source. So the power source is going to pull electrons from the anode and push them to the cathode. So if we look at a diagram of an electrolytic cell, we have the anode and the cathode in an electrolyte solution, and we have a power source that connects the two. So that power source is going to pull electrons out of the anode and push them into the cathode. So we still have oxidation occurring at the anode, it's losing electrons, and we have reduction occurring at the cathode, it's gaining electrons. It's just being helped to do that by the power source. So when that happens, the anode is going to become positively charged because the power source is taking electrons away, which are negatively charged, leaving the anode positively charged. And the cathode, for the similar reason, becomes negatively charged because all these electrons are going there. So then what happens is within the electrolyte, you've got positive ions and negative ions. So the negative ions, which are called anions, move toward the anode, where they are oxidized. So they're losing those electrons. So they move, so the electrons are pulled away, the anode becomes positive, the negative ions move there and then start donating their electrons to the anode to be pulled over to the cathode. On the other side, the positive ions, which are the cations, move toward the cathode, where they gain the electrons that have been pulled away from the anode. So if we look at an example, so in this electrolytic cell, there's a solution of copper 2 sulfate. So we're carrying out the electrolysis of a copper 2 sulfate solution using inert graphite electrodes. Inert meaning that the electrodes are not going to react. So if you remember from the galvanic cells, the electrodes were involved in the reaction. In this example of an electrolytic cell, the electrodes are not involved in the reaction. So you get the charge separation set up where the anode is positive and the cathode is negative. So the copper 2 ions are going to be attracted to the negatively charged cathode, and the sulfate ions are going to be attracted to the positively charged anode. And so if we look at each of those separately, so at the cathode, where we had the copper ions there attracted to the cathode, there are two possible reduction reactions that could occur there. So the copper ions could be reduced, right? They could take those electrons that are coming from the other side of the cell and be converted into copper, solid copper. So that reduction can occur. But remember that that electrolyte is an ionic compound dissolved in water. So water itself could also be reduced. And the reaction for the reduction of water is given here. So 2 water molecules and 2 electrons gets converted into hydrogen gas and hydroxide ions. So those 2 things could occur. And so there are ways to calculate which would occur, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So for now, we're just going to say that we can tell which reaction occurs based on observations that occur during the reaction. So for example, if the reduction of copper ions is occurring, you're going to see that reddish orange color of copper show up on the electrode. Whereas if the reduction of water is happening, then you're going to see bubbles forming because you're forming hydrogen gas. So based on what you observe, you could figure out what reaction is actually happening. So then if we look at the anode, there are 2 possible oxidation reactions that could occur. So first of all, there's the sulfate ions that can be oxidized. So 2 sulfate ions lose 2 electrons to make an S2O8 ion. So that's one reaction that could occur. Or, just like at the other side, we could get the oxidation of water. And the oxidation reaction for water is that water breaks down into half an oxygen molecule, 2 hydrogen ions, and 2 electrons. So again, you would know if the oxidation of water is occurring because there would be bubbles forming, because in this case, you're forming oxygen gas. So for this example, the reactions that actually do occur are the copper reduction and the water oxidation. So those are the ones that do occur. And so you can figure out the overall reaction by adding those 2 reactions together. So the electrons cancel out and we get that copper ions react with water to make solid copper, half an oxygen gas, and 2 hydrogen ions. So that's what is occurring in that specific example of an electrolytic cell. So next we're just going to talk about electroplating, which is an application of electrolysis, and it's a very common application. So this is a process that involves depositing a layer of metal onto another object using electricity. So there's lots of different examples. So some are with jewelry, right? So the main part of the jewelry might be made of nickel or steel, and then it would have gold or silver plated onto it, right? Because gold and silver are more expensive, so we wouldn't want to necessarily make the jewelry all out of gold or silver. Gold, when it's pure, is also very soft, so wouldn't be ideal. Another example are coins, right? So the loonie, for example, is bronze plated onto nickel, and also cutlery, right? So silver cutlery is often silver plated onto steel. So how this works, so it's an electrolytic cell. The object that you're trying to coat is the cathode. So in the example that's shown here, we're plating silver onto a spoon that's made of iron. So the cathode is the spoon, and then the anode is made of the metal that you're plating. So we're plating silver onto the spoon, so the anode is made of silver. And then the electrolytic solution contains ions of the metal being plated. So in this case, the silver ions. So what happens is the same as in the other electrolytic cells. The power source is going to pull electrons from the anode and move them to the cathode. And then it will reduce the metal ions into the pure metal, which will then be deposited on the object being plated. So the silver ions from the solution will join together with the electrons that are being pulled from the anode, and then it will change them into solid silver, which will coat the spoon. At the anode, as the electrons are pulled away, the silver is being converted into silver ions, which are released into the electrolyte solution, and are replacing those that are being used at the cathode. So the solid silver of the anode is being converted into silver ions and electrons. So essentially, the silver from the anode is being oxidized into silver ions and then being reduced back into solid silver, but in a different location on the spoon. So you're moving the silver from the anode to the spoon. And so that's a way that electrolysis can be used for a practical purpose. So that's an overview of electrolytic cells.